116th Reading Online Sport Economics Seminar. I should say it's a Reading Online Sports Economics Seminar kindly hosted on location by the University of Navarra here in Pamplona in Spain, where I am visiting, and I'm a very generous and kind guest of Pedro Garcia del Barrio, who's also on the call. So it's, I won't rename it to the noses or something, but we'll carry on as is. And before we kick off, there's Pedro. You might be able to see him on his screen. I can see him on my screen. We're kicking off a couple of bits of administration about upcoming in-person conferences. If you do want to come or go to Reading, I'll be back in Reading in a few days' time, and then we're having our second Reading Football Economics Workshop. That's the 13th and 14th of December, same 2 days as the World Cup semi-finals. Then you can join us for that. There's a registration link. I'll put that registration link in the chat. And then we'll be moving into 2023 in conference season. And there's two conferences in Budapest worth pointing out. One is the Sport Economics Sports Management SESM conference. That's going to be in Budapest 25th, 26th of May. And more immediate is that the call for papers deadline is 31st of December. So if you are interested in attending the Sports Economics Sports Management Conference in Budapest, 25th, 26th of May next year, do get your submission in by the end of the month before Christmas, basically. There's also another conference in Budapest next summer, which is the Math Sport, the 10th Math Sport International Conference. That's 26th, 28th of June. So they're not really very close to each other, sadly. So you might want to either take a month-long trip to Budapest or take two separate trips, or pick one or the other. But the Math Sport International Conference is in Budapest. Feedback somewhere. I don't know if that's you, Christian.
Sorry.
That's okay, but we're very pleased in this.
I was using a different computer for the audio and for the video. Sorry.
No worries, no worries. As long as it all works, that's the main thing. We'd like to have Christian Ruzzier from. I haven't got any details to hand. My computer crashed a few minutes ago, but he's going to present a paper called "Making a Maradona: Meat Consumption and Soccer Prowess," which looks absolutely fascinating. And so what I'm going to do is simply hand over to Christian to take away his presentation.
Thank you very much, James. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you all for coming. Let me share my screen, and we'll kick off. Sorry. There we go. And so, are you?
We've got some kind of prompt on the screen.
I'm sorry. I don't know what happened. Okay.
Yeah, we've got your slides now, so that seems to work.
There we go. Okay, so now you're seeing it correctly, right? I'm sorry if I look on my side from time to time, it's because I'm looking at your faces on the other computer, right? So if that's, I'm happy to be interrupted anytime you want. Just open up your microphones if that's okay for you, and just interrupt me, and then we can discuss everything. So this is joint work with Martin Rossi, who's also
Christian seems to have. Christian, are you there?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Let me change computer.
Okay. Bit of feedback as well.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
It's okay.
I'm sorry. I don't know what's happening with the other connection. I'm sorry. So let me just change things. Is that okay? You're watching my...
Yep, we can see your slides.
Okay. I don't know why it's... I'm so sorry.
Okay, technology always fails when we need it most.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. I don't know why you're not seeing my full screen presentation.
It might be because, I mean, it might be worth just unsharing and resharing just the PowerPoint window. That might work.
Let me just try again. I'm sorry. So I'll share. Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah, there we go. Sorry.
That's great.
Start again. So let me begin with, let's call it an empirical regularity from casual observation. And you can check it yourself. These are the top 3 football's greatest players of all times from 9 rankings out of the zillion rankings that you can find through a quick search in Google. The names are always the same. So this begs the question of what do Pelé, Maradona, Messi, Cristiano Ronaldo, Johan Cruyff have in common other than being consistently ranked among the greatest players of all times? And if you think about this for a little while, you might come to the same conclusion as we have, is that all of them were born and raised in countries of high per capita consumption of meat and within low income and working class households. And the central point in this paper is that this is not a coincidence. Rather, I will argue that there's a causal connection between meat consumption, especially when you're young, and the probability of achieving football excellence. I'm sorry, the title was meant for an American audience, so now I'm free to call it football as it should be, right? So I apologize if another soccer appears in the presentation, okay? So what I will do first is make my casual argument. Sorry, I'm mixing my causal argument. Okay. And then I will provide you with some evidence, correlational evidence that is consistent with the causal argument. And in the end, I will return to the issue of causality, right? So the story is simple, then I will unpack it. What we think is that the combination of relatively cheap meat and low opportunity cost of pursuing a career in professional football can explain this association that I mentioned before between meat consumption, your socioeconomic status, and your football talent. These have 2 parts. First, coming from a country where meat is relatively cheap means that even if you're poor, you can have access to a higher quality diet, which is crucial, that I will argue, for the development of the brain in general, and in particular of the cognitive functions which are necessary for top performance in football. And on the other hand, being relatively poor means also that the opportunity cost of pursuing a career in professional football should be lower. And it's the combination of both that yield this relationship between meat consumption and soccer prowess, football prowess, as we have called it in the title of the paper. So before unpacking the ingredients and telling you what the empirical exercise is all about, I should tell you why you should care about this. But given the audience, I think this is pretty obvious. Football is the most popular sport in the world. And it's the #1 sport for audience, for viewers, for professionals, for market value, and even for research. And within professional football, as in many other domains, the key resource is talent. So identifying talent is of crucial importance for a multi-billion dollar business, which is what football is nowadays. Okay, so let me tell you about this link between meat and soccer talent and football talent, which goes through the brain and is mediated by poverty. So let me start with the arrow which goes from brain to talent. So football requires many things from the players, physical abilities, motor coordination, which have been the focus of most research. But as it turns out, these important factors have very low predictive power. I mean, if you, let's say, if you regressed soccer talent on physical abilities and motor coordination, the R-square would be low. That would be my point. So recently there has been a renewed interest in looking at other factors that explain talent, and among these are cognitive functions and creativity-related processes, which might be important, especially what are called executive functions that have been associated with talented football players, even when you control for training and competitive level. And also, and more importantly, good executive functioning predicts success in the sport. I mean, none of this evidence is causal, to be honest, but it's pretty suggestive of a causal link between executive functioning of your brain and the likelihood that you're a top football player. Okay. So executive functions include processes like working memory, cognitive flexibility, inhibitory control, reasoning, problem solving, and are all linked to creativity also. And in many domains, all of these executive functions are what people refer to as game intelligence or football intelligence. So successful players in this sport are required to, change constantly when faced with a changing environment, and you have to make quick decisions. And as the environment changes, as the play progresses, you need to change what you have previously thought. And then it's where things like inhibitory control and cognitive flexibility are crucial, to be able to adapt quickly to the demands of the game. And on the other hand, working memory might be important for picturing the game, what might happen, for guessing what your rivals will do. And all of this are linked to creativity. When someone like Messi surprises us with an unexpected move, an unexpected pass, an unexpected shot, we might all agree that he's a very creative player. And actually, the evidence, recent evidence, shows that creativity is also a key factor for success in football. And as I argued before, creativity is linked to all these executive functions. So, summing up, there's good evidence to support the idea that better executive functions are important for soccer talent, for football talent. So then comes the other part of the story, in which I like to link nutrition, and in particular consumption of meat, with these executive functions that I argued recently that are important for football success. So it's hardly controversial to state that adequate nutrition is important for your brain in general, and in particular, it's very important for developing these executive functions that I mentioned before. And about nutrition, I would like to emphasize early childhood nutrition, because early childhood is a period of rapid brain development. And what you eat at this stage has long-lasting consequences for your brain, and in particular for the executive functions, that are important for football. And there's plenty of evidence that early life under nutrition has these long-lasting consequences on cognitive skills, and some of this evidence is indeed causal. So we have a causal link, it's a documented causal link from nutrition to executive functions, and then a likely causal link from executive functions to football talent. And where does meat come in? Meat is a high quality food because it's an easy way of getting most of the protein and micronutrients that are crucial for brain development. And actually, many people in the in the field of development have been, advocating for improved access to meat and other animal source foods in order to improve social and economic development among the poor. And again, we have causal evidence produced by someone else that increased consumption of meat early in life, have long-lasting cognitive consequences for the best. Even if you control for, income and schooling, which is other things that might affect your cognitive functions. Are we okay so far? Any questions? Okay. So let me now introduce poverty in all of this story, because there's an obvious link between, your family's income and what you eat. And actually, a low socioeconomic status correlates well with low quality diets for many reasons, but first and foremost, because typically you cannot afford high quality food like meat. And actually, poverty is one of the top reasons given for the absence of meat in the diet. When you survey poor people who do not consume animal source foods, they claim that the main cause is that they're too expensive for their income. So it's not the same in terms of your diet quality if you're a poor people born in Argentina than if you're a poor people born in, say, South Africa, to mention, okay? Because for the same level of income, it's easier for you to eat meat and hence have a higher quality diet when meat is relatively cheap, which happens in Argentina, but does not happen so much in South Africa. Okay. So first point of the argument will be that. Okay. And then what I'm claiming is that these cognitive functions are a necessary condition for success in football. I like the precondition for talent, but then talent has to be found, has to be developed, has to be nurtured. And there are many things that mediate this process, money, most importantly, infrastructure, interest in football in your country is not the same, if you are potentially talented if you are born in Argentina than if you're born in India, okay? And it's not the same if you're born in Argentina, where we are 47 million people, than if you're born in Uruguay, which are only 3 million people, okay? But what I like to emphasize is an even previous step, that even if you have the conditions for talent, even if you are in a country where talent can be found, can be developed, pursuing a professional career in football is a choice. Okay? So even if the preconditions are given for, brewing talent, individuals have to make the choice of, putting themselves in that path. So professional football is a career choice, and as such, it has competition. Okay, meaning, on the other hand, that pursuing a career in professional football has opportunity cost. And here comes then the final plot twist, is that, in choosing careers, professional football among them, opportunity costs are very, very important. Okay, as we have argued and shown elsewhere as well with Martin. So it is likely that individuals from low socioeconomic status households have lower opportunity cost. And actually, that was my point at the very beginning, most of the world's best football players, past and present, started life poor. And I will come back to this in a couple of minutes, more closer to the end of the presentation. And why poor people might have lower opportunity cost of engaging in professional soccer. Many reasons. They have just a couple. Boys from poor households are less likely to go to college. That's a fact. And living in crowded homes, typically they spend more time outdoors, and what they decide to do outdoors depends on the money they have. And just kicking a ball in the street with your mates, it's relatively cheap, and since you don't have money, you don't have many other options in which to spend your leisure activities, right? So that's the unpacked story. From this story come at least two predictions, which I'm going to try to provide evidence on behalf. So first of all, countries with high per capita consumption of meat should produce more football talent, even if you control for all the things that I said before, like wealth, size of the country, and interest in football, which are the usual controls in this literature. And on the other hand, most talented players should come from low socioeconomic status households in high per capita consumption countries. The claim of the second prediction is basically that the rankings that I've shown you at the very beginning should be true more generally, and this is not just among the greatest football players of all times. Okay, so what I will try to do now is provide you some correlational evidence consistent with these predictions. And as I said before, I'll come back to a discussion of causality at the very end. And so in terms of data, so what I'm going to do first is regression analysis. I will put a measure of soccer talent, of football prowess. I'm just calling it soccer there because it's the name of the variable that appears in the tables afterwards, which we can discuss afterwards whether it's the best measure of soccer talent, right? Which in our case will be the number of players born in a given country that have been nominated to the Ballon d'Or in the period 2016 to 2019. So this before the pandemic, right? So we have 59 different players from 25 different countries that were nominated in this period. And, the country that contributes the most to that list is France, followed by the usual suspects: Brazil, the Netherlands, Spain, Argentina, Uruguay, England, etc., etc., etc. We've also used this new award, the best. Nothing changes. And at some point, we were playing with a different measure of talent, which we have used in our previous paper with Martin, which is in the World Bank Economic Review, which has to do with the number of players that each country has playing in the top 5 European leagues. Okay, and the results are qualitatively similar. So let me stick with this, with our preferred measure, which means, on the other hand, that we're looking only at the very tip of the iceberg. These are the really, really top players in the world, and 59 might seem very few, but there's actually huge variability, and we are trying to exploit that in the empirical exercise. And on the right-hand side, the first thing that I want to put is a measure of consumption of meat, and we have this from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. And what I call meat consumption is the per capita consumption of meat in a given year, which is 2,000, and I'll explain briefly why 2,000 in kilograms. Okay, and well, you have it there. The reason we chose 2,000 is because it's roughly at the same time as the early childhoods of all the Ballon d'Or nominees that we have in our sample. So remember, the story was, when you're young, what you eat really matters for the long run. So then we're going to look at you 20, 25 years after your childhood and see whether you are a very talented football player or not. And then we will use, as many other people have done before, several controls. Okay, population. because that's the law of large numbers. A larger population means that it's you have a large supply of potentially talented people. A measure of income at the country level, which is gross national income per capita in a case, which is taken from the World Bank data. And finally, we have a measure of interest in soccer at the country level, which is basically, this is data from the FIFA 2006 pick count. That was a survey, and I'm sure most of you know it, that measured the number of people actively involved in soccer in football in many dimensions, and we divide that by population. Okay, because it's not the same to have 1 million people involved in football in Argentina than in Andorra, let's say. Okay, great. So there you have some summary statistics of the variables that I have just mentioned. So as I said before, the average country has a third of a player nominated to the Ballon d'Or, but the standard deviation is huge. And you go from a minimum of 0, which is most countries in a sample, like 90% of the countries, and a maximum of 11, that's France, which I showed you before. But you can also see there's a huge variability in meat consumption, which is my main explanatory variables across countries. Okay, so from countries that only consume 3 kilos on average per year to countries that consume over 100 kilos of meat per year. So I was going to say carne, but that's Spanish. And then I explain why we're using also protein consumption. You have huge variability in population, in income, and also in interest in soccer. So the thing that I will do is run an OLS regression with robust standard errors, okay, which includes all these variables. So my coefficient of interest is beta. It's the effect of meat consumption on soccer prowess. And besides the controls that I mentioned before, I will include continent fixed effects in some of the specifications, and then explain why we're thinking of this as a cross section, which is why there's no time sub index in my regression, because I could easily build a panel of soccer talent, meat consumption, and all of the controls. But the reason why we've chosen to work with a cross-section is that we truly believe that the main variability comes from the cross-section. It's not the time series that will give you, let's say, identification of the effect. It's rather the cross-section, the differences between countries, okay, and not the evolution of the consumption of meat within country, okay, which is what I would explore if I had panel data with country fixed effect or something like that. So the true variability comes from the cross-section. That's what we truly believe, and that's why we are simplifying things and directly running a cross-sectional analysis. Great. So, sorry, any questions before I go to the result?
Hi, Christian.
Yeah.
Yes, this is Jorge. Yeah. I'm sorry, my camera is off today. I have 2 questions. When you say soccer prowess is the 59 players because they were nominated for the Ballon d'Or, you are using only the 3 or the top 3 nominations, something like that, because yearly nominations are like 50 players nowadays. So I was wondering about that. I guess you are just choosing some subsample of the nominees. And the other thing is that in Latin America, even in Brazil, especially in Brazil, I guess, and Argentina, I guess, consumption per strata, per socioeconomic status varies a lot in terms of how much meat and this kind of food they eat. I mean, rich people eat more meat per capita than poor people. So I would imagine, or I would think that you would need to include some kind of variable controlling for this, or even some kind of interaction. For instance, the I don't know, the percentage of the population that is living below $1 a day, by the bank, World Bank standards or something like that. And the third question is, you're taking in this period, players like Messi, they moved to Spain very early in their life, 13 years old, and he really, I guess, he feels very much Argentinian, but he did move to Spain, and food in the Mediterranean is different. And I guess your work, it would be nice to go back a lot, because I as soon as you started to talk, I remember Rivaldo, the Brazilian that played in Deportivo. When he arrived to Spain, he was undernourished, and he was so skinny that he had to be, and that is common for a lot of Latin American players, including those from Brazil and Argentina. And he was, for a year, he was dedicated to special nutritionist stuff to try to build some mass into him, and that many European clubs do to Latin American players. They just did it for Luis Diaz in Porto because they are undernourished a lot. So I guess that's my questions for now. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Let me just see if I can remember everything. So let me begin backwards. It's true that Messi, moved to Spain when he was 13. But what I'm arguing is that what's important for my story is what Messi ate from 0 to 5 years, and that was in Argentina. Okay, and the case of Rivaldo, it's very interesting. It's because you said it. He was on a special diet to build muscle. And that's actually a link between nutrition and football talent that has been emphasized before, and I have nothing against that argument. There's, I think, I've seen it in a book by Stefan Szymanski and a co-author, the argument about South Africa, in that they thought that one of the reasons that they did not excel in football was that they were undernourished, but in terms of they were short or not, they didn't have enough muscle and stuff like that. But my argument is different, and it's probably complementary in the sense that what matters is what nutrition does for your brain, and that's of the utmost importance in your early childhood. And that's not, and at that point, a kid like Messi was in Argentina eating meat. And it's true that that's one of the limitations of the analysis in terms of data. My story includes poverty as a proxy for low opportunity costs of your time, and there's nothing of that in my regression. And it's at some point we trying to include in the regression a thing like you mentioned it, the fraction of people living under the $2 poverty line or stuff like that. But it's the really important thing is not that within a country like in Brazil or in Argentina, rich people consume more meat than poor people. The thing is that for a given level of income, of family income, a poor people in Argentina consumes more meat than a poor people in South Africa or Ethiopia or even Switzerland, and that's an interaction that is difficult to capture because I don't know meat consumption by socioeconomic level, which would be great to have, and I could explore my story even in more depth if I could do that, and then you have the question on which nominees we are using. I'm guessing, I don't recall it perfectly right now, but I'm guessing you must be right, because if we only have 59 nominated players in 4 years, it must be the case that we are only working with the top 3 or top 5, which make it to the final cut. But I have the data. I could expand this and also try out whether this. I don't recall whether we have done that. I'd mentioned a couple of things that we also tried and that were consistent with the results that I'm presenting today. I haven't done what you're suggesting, but it's a very good suggestion, and I will try it out and let you know. Okay, great. If that answers the questions, I'll move to results and we can continue discussing. So first, let me show you several specifications of this basic regression. which you have now there. So in the first column, I'm only controlling for population because I'm not using players per capita. I'm using the level of players. So it's always important to control for population, even for that. And then I'm adding controls from one column to the next. And the final column includes also continent fixed effects which are basically, it would be the same if I included federation fixed effects, because other than in America, you have a federation per continent, so it's basically the same. And you see it in the first line. You know, there's a positive, statistically significant effect of my measure of meat intake when football players were young, and my measure of football talent. The numbers are not that easy to interpret, but in terms of economic significance, the effect that you see in the table means that a 1 standard deviation increase in the consumption of meat, which is a huge increase, right? It's like 30 kilos per year, which you add a country, but you can find countries to see if you go from this country to this other country which consume 30 kilos per year more per capita of meat, you would see on average an increase of 1/3 of a standard deviation in soccer prowess, which is basically a standard deviation was it's like almost half a player more in terms of nominees for the Ballon d'Or. Okay, and it's interesting also that none of the controls of the control variables are significant in these regressions. So I haven't tried this out, but other people have done like predictive models in which basically what they are doing is running a regression like mine, but without meat consumption, and all the other variables become relevant in that explanation. Actually, for the past World Cup, The Economist published an article in which they have one of these models, and they looked at which country were overachievers or underachievers as compared to the average regression line of this kind of success in football and variables like my controls here. I think it's not a coincidence that the top overachievers in that publication were all countries of the highest per capita consumption of meat in my sample, like Spain, Argentina, Uruguay, etc., etc., etc. Okay, so I guess there's something in the search for causes of football talent. It looks like nutrition, and in particular meat consumption, has something to add to the picture. So what we did next was take a more general measure of food intake, which is protein consumption from the same source, and you have basically the same story there. Okay. So this is consistent with my first prediction. So my story predicted that there would be a strong conditional correlation between meat consumption when young and soccer talent, controlling for all these variables that are also important for football talent. Okay. My second story, my second prediction implied that we should find that most of these very talented players come from low-income households. So what we did is we Googled all the 59 players that we have in a list of nominees. Okay, Googled the personal early life stories and classified them according to socioeconomic status. Okay. There's no obvious way to do this. We put several research assistants to do this independently. Okay, and they all came with the same classification of players. So in that sense, let me call it robust. Okay, so what we did was, put them in 3 different categories: high class, which includes middle high class, the middle class, and low, which includes also middle low. Okay, and for instance, in my sample, 33 players, come from low or middle low income families, 16 from middle income families, and 10 only from high or middle high income families. Okay, so, and then I can also, what I would like to have ideally was, I would like to call Messi and Cristiano Ronaldo and all the other guys and ask them if they recall how many meat they consumed per year when they were young. But I cannot do that. So I am assigning each of the players the average consumption of meat when they were young in their country of origin, which is the same data that I used before. And I divide this in terciles. So and then you have high consumption of meat, middle consumption of meat, and low consumption of meat at the country level. And with these two dimensions, I simply build a table. We have two entries. One has to do with socioeconomic status, and the other has to do with consumption of meat in your country of origin. So if my story were true, you should have, a larger than expected fraction of, I don't know if you see my pointer, but you should have a larger than expected fraction of players in this bottom left cell that I have here. So with the data at hand, we populated the cells and we found exactly that. So if you see that, almost half of the players in my sample come from countries with high per capita consumption of meat and were raised in low-income families, which is, again, this is quantitative, qualitative evidence, which is consistent with my second prediction. Okay. And in terms of data, that's it. Okay, that's so I provided a story which is causal, that ties meat consumption when young with football talent, which goes through the brain, through the executive functions that are important for excelling in professional football, and that is mediated by poverty, because poverty determines opportunity costs of time of pursuing a career in professional football, and professional football is a career choice, and hence, even if you have the preconditions for being a talented player, you need to choose to do that rather than doing something else with your life. Okay, and to the extent that my story is true, some of the, let me put the example that we have in the paper, which is China. Okay, it's a stated goal of China's current president, Mr. Xi, to have China become a football superpower by 2015. And to achieve this, China is investing huge amounts of money in building training centers, hiring teachers, building stadiums. And to be honest, they don't have much to show for the time being. We are far away from 2050, but they failed to qualify for the current World Cup, and they had also failed to qualify for the previous one. So to the extent, again, that my story is correct, some of those $1 million that are being spent on infrastructure and teachers might be put to better use in improving the nutrition of Chinese toddlers. And this is also true for every country. It's also a good idea because it's good for people in general to improve nutrition, but in terms of developing talent and nurturing talent, it seems like what young kids eat is of crucial importance. Yeah. So I've promised several times that I would say something about causality. So let me end with that, and then I will take questions and discussions and whatever you see, whatever you see fit. So what would be the ideal experiment here? So what would allow me to claim with high confidence that the relationship between meat consumption and soccer talent, football talent, is a causal one? So my ideal experiment would be, get a very large number of kids early in life, and feed half of them, selected at random, meat. Then wait something like 25 years and look them up and see whether there's any difference in how they did in professional football, depending on whether they were in my treated group or in my control group. And given that something like 4% of the world population is actively involved in soccer, but at only a tiny fraction of that 4% makes it to the big leagues, and hence it's a truly talented football player. So to measure that impact, you would need a very, very large number of kids, and and it will also be very expensive to feed them with meat during the first 5 years of their life. So that would be the ideal experiment. If I could do that, I would do it, and I would know whether it's actually true that the effect is causal. Okay. Second best would be to find an instrument for meat consumption, and we've thought a lot about that. And these instruments, good instruments, are not easy to come by. At some point, full disclosure, because I'm interested in your opinions and your takes on this. We were thinking about, determinants of some like natural determinants of, how easy it is to raise cattle, let's say, which has to do with pastures and the ideal instrument would be like some of these measures of suitability for meat production that is very far in the past, like 2 centuries ago, which obviously might have an impact through GDP per capita, but I'm controlling for that. Okay, but we couldn't find that measure, so we abandoned the pursuit of an instrument, and we ended up with this simple regression. So the only way that I have to claim causality for my results is if I'm willing to make the conditional independence assumption, which basically means that conditional on all the things that I've controlled for in the regression, selection bias disappears, and hence the regression coefficient beta that I mentioned before has actually a causal interpretation. I'm not particularly inclined to make this assumption. That's why I've been very careful about causality for the time being. But on the other hand, and this is my final comment, I would be hard pressed if you ask me to identify a control that I'm missing. I don't know if I'm being clear. And I would be very happy to receive suggestions on what else I should put on the right-hand side of my regression to be able to claim that the conditional independence assumption is plausibly a good assumption. Okay, so on my end, that's it. Thank you very much. I'll be happy to take questions and discuss anything that you desire.
Thanks very much, Christian. I'm going to give you a Teams round of applause and open up the floor for questions. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to put your hand up and unmute yourself. Bernd.
Thanks for the presentation. I have a suggestion that is perhaps only loosely related to your topic. There's a large body of literature documenting the limited cognitive abilities of Muslim kids whose mothers have fasted during Ramadan early in their pregnancy. So that is somewhat related to your hypothesis that dieting in early childhood is important. So these studies, for example, show that these kids have significantly lower IQs because their mothers did not eat well.
Great. That's a great suggestion. I'll look it up, but it's actually very related because it's the idea. I mean, since I cannot have the causal regression, part of the burden of the proof is on the argumenting of the story, which is actually causal, and it has several links, and the causal link between nutrition and the brain is one of the main ingredients. And then you have the link between, you know, the brain and soccer, which, you know, coming by with causal evidence is much more difficult. But there are many people working on this, and yeah, that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, thanks, Christian. Pedro.
Okay, good afternoon. Thank you for the very interesting delivery. One comment and one question to you, or even to the other people, econometricians especially. The comment being, you know, my concern is about potential spurious correlation if those countries in which meat consumption is higher happens to be those countries by chance in which tradition for football as the leading sport is the case. You know, I don't know, Argentina happens to be a very much focused football country, but they also benefit, they enjoy having very nice meat, etc. So it is just cultural. And then the question about, to me, those top genius, top class players, they are, but I'm not an econometrician, so just please to maybe you or somebody else to let me know if those guys are considered outliers because they are, you know, out of the norm. Is it that because you gather many outliers, 59, I think you mentioned, that we can still trusting on the statistics rules? Although there was this comment on the subsample or perhaps taking into account nominees, but if we concentrate on the actual Ballon d'Or, each of them is a kind of outlier from is it correct? Or
okay, let me begin with your last question. I mean, there's a problem there in that we are dealing with talent, and top talent is basically by definition an outlier, because you have, so in that sense you will always have some, in a sense you will always have a problem of outliers because you're looking at the tip of the at the extreme of the distribution. But I think it's highly unlikely that just the 60 players that come from only 25 countries, from the almost 200 that I have in my sample, that they come, it is very unlikely that they will all come from countries with high per capita consumption of meat. So in that sense, I think the fact that they are outliers actually runs against me. It makes it more difficult for me to find an effect. But I think a better answer to your question on that dimension is that if I use alternative definitions of talent, which look at a large number of players, the effect is also there. Not with the, what I still have to try is a suggestion that I received before of trying with all the nominees and not just the top nominees. Okay, but we've done at the very beginning, we've done regressions with the number of players born in a given country which are playing in the top 5 European leagues, and you get basically the same story. So it's not just that these particular guys are driving my results and it's just a coincidence. Okay. In terms of your first comment, I completely agree that, you know, football tradition in a country is very important. That's why I'm controlling for it. So my measure of interest in soccer was meant to capture precisely that. So to the extent that, you know, number of people actively involved in football as a fraction of the population captures football tradition in a country, that's not a problem for my results. So I'm controlling for that. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks.
thanks.
Stefan.
Hi, Christian. It's a very interesting question, actually. But so firstly, I have sort of two things. So firstly, could you give us a conflict of interest declaration that you're not being paid by the Argentine Meat Confederation in order to write this paper, right? So there's slight suspicion. So that's sort of not entirely serious point, but I think that there's a Muslim, but I'm completely convinced that diet of children is going to have an effect on their subsequent performance. But it's not. But surely it's not meat per se. You're not saying that you have to eat dead animals, dead livestock in order to have these benefits. It's the nutrients, right? So and I was just doing a little bit of Googling. There's vitamin A is very important. Zinc is very important. But there are other places you can get those things. You get zinc from fish. That's a very good source of zinc. You get vitamin A from carrots. That's a very good source of vitamin A. So someone looking at your research would say, well, what if I did per capita carrot consumption in different countries? Wouldn't that give me just exactly the same kind of results? And places where they eat more carrots, you're going to have better results. So I slightly worry about that. And then, and I just want to add, I think Pedro's right about the point about these outliers, right? I think it is. So I'm not exactly sure how to phrase this, but I think it's looking for these trends in the outliers is slightly odd. And maybe one suggestion is, why not look at the youngest level of international competition that you can find? So, for example, what about they have under 17 international competitions, right? So that's pretty young. And there you might find amongst those, if what you're saying is true, before they've had opportunities to have other developments, maybe at that level you would find that you'd have more observations, and you wouldn't be focusing so much on the superstars who really, not necessarily representative of the effects that you're interested in.
Okay, great. Yeah. So in terms of your last point, that's a good idea. I could do that. But do you think that using all the players that a given country has playing in the top 5 European leagues would be enough to deal with your concern about outliers, or you consider them to be also outliers in that sense?
Yeah, anybody who gets to play at that level is an absolute outlier.
Okay.
I mean, the talent required is extraordinary, right?
Great. Yeah. Point taken. That's fine. So your point is basically look at these kids before they get to the top of the pyramid.
At the earliest stage you possibly can.
Yeah. Okay. So it's that data is harder to come by, but I'm sure you can build some measures of. Yeah, I agree. I'm sorry that it's very challenging for me to present here because I'm not a sports economist, as you might have already discovered. Okay, but so that's why it was also so interesting to have this opportunity. And regarding your first point, I totally agree. It's not meat per se. It's what you get from meat. And but the point is, I have at least 2 points there. First is that meat is a good package to get all of the important nutrients. And I've read somewhere that what you get from a tiny slice of meat, in terms of iron, for instance, if you would have to get that from protein, if you have to get that from plants, you need to eat like 60 kilos per day to get the same, and that's not feasible actually. So that's the advantage of meat. But I'm totally with you on the fact that it's what meat has inside, not meat per se. And you might find other sources of the same micronutrients, and they should have the same effect as per my story. Okay.
When you say meat, does that include fish in your view, or is the fish different? I mean, the Spanish, right? The Spanish diet is very heavily fish-based, and look at they had 1 or 2 good players. 1 or 2, not many, but a few.
I should check the definition of meat consumption in the FAO data to see whether it includes. I'm pretty sure it includes poultry, not just red meat. So I'm guessing it's likely that it also includes fish, but I'm not certain. That I have to check that up. But on the other hand, we also have the other regression with protein consumption, which is protein from any source. And you have the same story. That's one thing that you can get from meat, which is protein. But there are also, zinc, iron, and other micronutrients that are also important. The fact that we are leading with meat is there's path dependence there, right? I'm from Argentina, and we eat meat, and we love football, and in that sense, there's a conflict of interest that I must disclose. And but it's true, because you come to a country like Argentina and you go to the poorest neighborhoods and you will find people eating meat. And that's not common. And going from that observation to the idea that might have a consequence for the talent, football talent that is produced in the country, it's a huge leap. And that's what we've tried to do in this paper, right? But yeah, I agree with both of your points.
Thanks, Stefan. Any other questions, comments, Volker? Jorge.
Christian, hi again.
Yes.
My suggestion is that, taking on the point that Stefan makes, you probably should move the paper to nutrition. And I think it would be very interesting, because if you go ahead with meat, there is a large literature of nutritionists and even the economists arguing that meat is not good, actually, for many things. So you probably, I suggest you take that point. But my comment is that if you pursue that direction, that's one thing you've been saying, is that poor people in Argentina eat a lot of meat, and in Switzerland they don't. But if you go to the development economist direction, you have to be very careful, because any poor household in Switzerland, or in Europe, for that case, in Western Europe at least, has nothing to do with what we have here in Latin America in terms of poor households. I would like to see data that you can find in the national statistical agencies in Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay about the per capita meat consumption per household socioeconomic status. Because I do have the data in my head for Colombia, and I would say, yes, every household has coffee here in the morning. And that's what you're saying for Argentina in terms of meat. But we have a lot of cows too, not as much as Argentina and Uruguay. But the general data for Latin America is that poor households eat very little meat. And the story of meat in Brazil, if I am correct, does sell for the southern part of Brazil, not for the northern part. So I think you would just need some extra data to try to convince people about the story on poor households really being able to eat meat in Argentina and in the south cone of South America. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So for the thing that you mentioned with my example of Switzerland, it's true that it's not the same to be poor in Switzerland than to be poor in Latin America. But that's consistent with my story, because it's a thing of opportunity costs. It's not just what you eat. If you eat, your brain will develop, but maybe in Switzerland you go to college if you come from a low income family, even if you ate what you had to eat. So it's actually the combination of both. I've never said that if you emit, the country will have more football talent. You have both ingredients, and that's why your second point is very useful, because to drive the point home, I would actually need something like consumption of meat per income level or something like that, which I'm thinking I might get from the expenditure surveys that I used to build the baskets for the price indexes. For the case of Argentina, I cannot think of any other source for those data, but statistical availability of statistical data availability in Argentina is very, very poor. But I would need to look into that. You're true. You're right. I'm sorry. Thank you.
Thanks, Jorge. Now we've got Jean-Louis even. Jean-Louis, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Do you hear me now?
Yep.
Yeah.
My concern is how you go from the correlation analysis to the causal inference. It's my main concern because there is a so huge gap between the two. And for instance, if you read the books by Julia Pearl or Donald Rubin and all these complicated things you have to take into account before going from one side to the other. Why not taking into account vitamin, minerals, and all kind of nutriments, and why don't taking into account also education and so forth? So you just concentrate on a very special aspect, is meat consumption. I'm concerned with that.
No, I mean, I totally agree. Sorry, I'm just taking notes. That's why I've been so very careful of not claiming causality. I've just left that very brief discussion to the end, just to put the idea out there and see whether what would be required for a causal interpretation of my results, because my story is causal, but my results are just correlational. Yes. Conditional correlations and stuff. But I would never claim, I said I was very reluctant to make the conditional independence assumptions, which would be the only way of jumping from my results to a causal interpretation. And I'm not willing to do it, because that's why I've never said that I'm providing causal evidence that my mechanism is, my story is true, okay?
That reminds me, as a geneticist, the endless debate we have, for instance, on IQ, and we were never able to come up with a definitive answer about this question. So it seems to me that we should be very cautious with that respect. Sorry.
Okay. So what do you mean? I mean, in terms of IQ?
I mean, causal inference is something very difficult. And I remember when it's a different subject, I think 2 weeks ago, about discussing about the probability of winning the competitions, Stefan pointed out to me that I was too much causal, and when you predict, you can take anything. I think it was really the basic, in case of prediction, you don't care about the nature of the variables, predicted variables. When you are making causal inference, it's a different side you have to look at.
I must agree with you, because there's nothing, I mean.
And in many cases, sorry, your study can be interpreted in a different way as the one you have in mind also.
And what will be that?
In the sense that they will put forward the causal aspects, and even if you make some restriction in your text or in your discussion, in your talk.
Okay. Yes, yeah. I mean, if a reviewer of an editor are looking for would demand, you know, causal evidence of this, that I'm not providing. That's for sure. But I've been very open about this from the very beginning, because, you know, the ideal experiment is simply infeasible. So.
And the sampling aspect's also very important. You take a very selected samples, and that could be discussed also.
Yeah. I've received that comment from other attendees. Yeah. So it's an interesting thing, and I you know, written it down here to take a deeper look into it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Louis, any more questions and comments? Well, as the author of a paper that does a regression similar to the one that you present, Christian, I will say that I've got a paper in a journal, and I'll share the link with you.
Yeah, please do.
One of the things that I went back to the table to look at the things that we put in there, since you asked about what other things might go in there, and one thing you put an answer to it, so you know, quite fine. But one thing that we did put in was the employment rate, on the idea that you might have a large population, but I guess it goes back to your point about the opportunity cost, I guess, at the end of the day, because the idea being, if you're employed, you've got a higher opportunity cost, or if you face a country with a higher employment rate, there's a higher opportunity cost of going to try and play football.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's again, what would be important would be the employment or unemployment rate by income level, probably also, but maybe you can capture something at the aggregate country level, and that's a good point. Thank you.
Yeah, and one thing we did to capture how into football or kind of the footballing infrastructure in a country was we used the date of the first recorded international football match for that country, which kind of gives some kind of proxy of, you know, how organized football has been and for how long.
Great. Yeah, I'm thinking something like that would be, you know, looking at when the national federation was, or national association was started, and something that will also give you a story of, say, tradition. My guess is that will correlate very highly with, you know, my measure of interest, but, you know, it's worth exploring. Yeah.
Any more questions and comments? Hands. Oh no, Jan Louis, is that still the same hand from before? Or is that a new hand up with a new question? Jan Louis?
No, I've finished. Thanks a lot.
Okay, fine. Well, in which case we can wrap up. I can tell you that it appears there's less drama today in the football. Uruguay seems to be progressing serenely into the last 16. They're 2-0 up just before half time. But yes, we'll stop there. And I'm just now going to try and find who our talk is next week. Just as yes, next week we have Brian Mills from the University of Texas presenting racially congruent leadership and firm performance. But thank you, Christian in particular, and thank you everyone for your contributions. Christian, it's a delight to have someone who's not a sports economist in this series, because there's always a risk that if you just talk amongst yourselves as sports economists, you don't hold to the kinds of standards that, you know, would be expected as economists. So it's a delight to have some your input, and hopefully it was useful for you as well. So thanks everyone. Enjoy the rest of the football, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I really enjoyed the experience, and thank all for your comments and suggestions and ideas. They're all very, very welcome.